I want you to imagine standing up in front of the same congregation that watched you grow up, the same people who held your hand when you were baptized, and hearing 200 of them turn completely silent the moment you start telling the truth. Not because the truth was wrong, but because the man at the altar had already told them, days earlier, that you were the one who could not be trusted. That is exactly what happened to me. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how the one man I trusted more than almost anyone in my life used his entire church against me. Not because I lied, but because I found something he never wanted anyone to find, and the only way he could protect himself was to make sure nobody believed me when I finally spoke. By the end of this story, you are going to understand exactly how a respected, beloved spiritual leader can turn an entire community against one woman in a matter of days, using nothing but careful words, selective silence, and the simple fact that people will almost always choose to believe the person with the most power in the room. And I want you to ask yourself, while you listen, what you would have done in my position. Because I promise you, it is not as simple as just telling the truth and trusting it to win. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand who I was before any of this happened, so you can understand exactly how far the fall went. I was 34 years old, unmarried, no children, which already made me something of an outlier in a congregation where most women my age were deep into raising families. I had been a member of that church since I was 7 years old. I grew up in that building. I was baptized in that building. My own parents were buried after services held in that building. Bishop Calloway, the man at the center of this entire story, had personally led my confirmation when I was a teenager, had officiated both of my parents' funerals years apart, and had, for almost 15 years, treated me like something between a daughter and a trusted member of his inner circle. I worked as a forensic accountant, a detail that matters enormously to this story, so keep it in mind. I had spent years auditing financial records for mid-sized companies, and I was good at my job, methodical, patient, the kind of person who notices a number that does not quite add up even when everyone else in the room has already moved past it. I volunteered at the church doing exactly that kind of work, helping manage the books for the building fund, the missions budget, the benevolence fund that was supposed to help families in the congregation who were struggling financially. I did this for free, every single month, for almost 6 years, because I believed wholeheartedly in what that money was supposed to do. I want you to sit with that detail for a second, because it is going to matter more than you think. The very skill that made me valuable to that church, the very thing Bishop Calloway praised me for constantly in front of the congregation, was the exact same skill that eventually made me dangerous to him. It started on an ordinary Tuesday evening, the kind of evening that feels completely unremarkable until years later when you realize it was the moment everything changed. I was reconciling the benevolence fund records for the quarter, comparing the deposits coming in from congregation donations against the disbursements going out to families who had applied for assistance, rent help, medical bills, that sort of thing. The numbers had never given me trouble before. The church was not large, maybe 400 members, and the fund typically processed somewhere between $15,000 and $25,000 a quarter, modest but meaningful money for the families who relied on it. But that quarter, the numbers did not add up, not by a small margin either. There was a gap of almost $11,000 between what had come in and what could be accounted for in approved disbursements. I assumed, at first, that I had simply made an error somewhere, a misplaced decimal, a duplicate entry, something mundane and embarrassing that I would find within an hour of careful review. I did not find that. I went back through 3 additional months of records, then 6, then a full year, and the pattern only became clearer the further back I went. Money was leaving the benevolence fund through disbursements that had no corresponding application on file, no family name attached, no signature of approval from the benevolence committee, just a category labeled miscellaneous pastoral discretionary use, a line item I had never once questioned before because, frankly, I trusted the man whose discretion it referred to completely. Over that single year, miscellaneous pastoral discretionary use accounted for almost $34,000. I did what I genuinely believed, at the time, was the responsible thing to do. I did not go to the congregation. I did not go to social media. I went directly to Bishop Calloway himself, privately, in his office, the same office where he had sat with me after both of my parents' funerals, holding my hand, praying with me through the worst weeks of my life. I brought the spreadsheets. I brought the bank statements. I laid them out on his desk, calmly, professionally, the way I would present findings to any client in my actual career, and I simply asked him to help me understand where this $34,000 had gone, because I could not reconcile it with anything on record. I watched his face very carefully while he looked at those numbers, because reading subtle reactions is something my job had trained me to do without even realizing I was doing it anymore. And what I saw was not confusion. It was not the face of a man encountering a surprising discrepancy for the first time. It was the face of a man who had been waiting, for longer than I wanted to admit to myself, for someone to finally notice. He recovered quickly, though. I will give him that. He told me the discretionary fund was sometimes used for sensitive situations that could not be documented in the normal application process, situations involving families in crisis who did not want their names attached to a public record, perhaps domestic situations, perhaps immigration concerns, perhaps medical privacy issues, situations where confidentiality mattered more than paperwork. He told me he appreciated my diligence, that it showed how much I cared about doing things properly, but that some of God's work simply could not be reduced to a clean spreadsheet. It was a good answer. I want to be honest about that. If I had not spent 6 years building an intimate, granular understanding of exactly how that fund operated, I might have accepted it completely and gone home that night feeling reassured rather than unsettled. But I did know how that fund operated, intimately, and I knew that every single disbursement, sensitive or not, had always come with at least a confidential code number assigned by the Benevolence Committee chair for tracking purposes, even when the family's actual name was withheld for privacy. These $34,000 had no code numbers at all. They existed completely outside the system meant to track even the most sensitive cases. I told him this, gently, not accusing him of anything, simply pointing out the discrepancy in his explanation. And for the second time that evening, I watched something shift behind his eyes. Something that looked, just for a moment, like genuine irritation, breaking through his calm exterior before he smoothed it back over with practiced warmth. He told me he would look into it personally and get back to me, and he thanked me again for my diligence, and he walked me to the door of his office, with his hand resting gently on my shoulder, the exact same gesture he had used to comfort me at my mother's funeral 5 years earlier. I left that office feeling something I could not fully name yet, but looking back now, I recognize it clearly. It was the feeling of a trap quietly closing, even though I could not yet see the shape of it. 2 days later, I noticed the first shift. Small, almost imperceptible if you were not paying close attention. The Benevolence Committee chair, a woman named Diane, who I had worked alongside for years, suddenly stopped responding to my emails about the upcoming quarterly report. When I called her directly, she answered, but her voice had a strange, careful distance to it that had never existed between us before. She told me, almost too quickly, that Bishop Calloway had mentioned he was personally reviewing some of the fund's recent allocations, and that she should hold off on finalizing anything until he gave further direction. I asked her if everything was okay, and she said yes, of course, everything is fine, in a tone that told me everything was absolutely not fine. By the end of that week, I noticed something else. People who had greeted me warmly every single Sunday for years, people I considered close friends within the congregation, began offering smaller smiles, shorter conversations, a kind of polite distance that felt almost clinical. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was projecting my own anxiety about the financial discrepancy onto completely normal social interactions. I wanted desperately to believe that, because the alternative felt too unsettling to face directly. I found out exactly what was happening on the following Sunday, during the announcements portion of the service, when Bishop Calloway stood at the pulpit and said something that, on the surface, sounded almost generous, almost protective, the kind of statement that would make anyone listening think he was being remarkably gracious. He told the congregation that some members had recently expressed concerns about certain financial matters within the church, and he wanted to address it directly and transparently, because transparency, he said, was something he valued deeply as their spiritual leader. He then said, and I am going to repeat this as close to word for word as I can recall it, because I have replayed this moment in my mind more times than I can count. He said, I want to be sensitive here, because I love every single person in this church family, including the person raising these concerns. But I think it's important for all of us to remember that financial stress and personal struggles can sometimes affect how we interpret situations, and I would ask everyone to extend grace and patience while we work through this internally, rather than letting outside speculation create division within our church family. He never said my name. He did not need to. Everyone in that congregation who had worked closely with the Benevolence Fund knew exactly who he was talking about, and within the careful, deliberate vagueness of his statement, he had managed to plant something far more damaging than any direct accusation could have. He had suggested, without ever technically saying it, that my concerns might be rooted in personal struggles, financial stress, instability, something inside me rather than something inside his bookkeeping. He had taken the exact same script every manipulative authority figure uses, turning the person who found the problem into the problem itself, and he had done it so smoothly, so wrapped in language of grace and love, that half the congregation walked away from that service believing he had just done something remarkably kind by not naming me directly. I sat in my pew that morning feeling the exact same cold, ringing silence I imagine anyone feels in the moment they realize the ground beneath them has quietly disappeared. I looked around at faces I had known my entire life, faces that had cried with me at 2 separate funerals, and I watched them carefully avoid making eye contact with me, the way people do when they have just been given permission, by someone they trust completely, to start doubting you. In the weeks that followed, the campaign against me, because that is exactly what it was, a campaign, became more organized and more devastating than I ever could have anticipated. Bishop Calloway never once attacked me directly or publicly in a way anyone could point to as concrete evidence of wrongdoing on his part. He was far too skilled for that. Instead, he worked in whispers, in carefully placed comments during private conversations with influential members of the congregation, in subtle reframings of my character that spread through the church's social fabric like smoke under a door. I learned, through a close friend, who eventually broke ranks and told me everything, that Bishop Calloway had been quietly suggesting to certain members of the elder board that my recent divorce, a divorce I had gone through nearly 4 years earlier, had left me emotionally unstable and prone to seeing betrayal and dishonesty in situations where none actually existed. He apparently described me, in private conversations, as someone who meant well but who had, in his words, a tendency to turn financial diligence into something closer to obsession since her marriage ended, framing my forensic accounting career itself, the very skill that had uncovered his financial discrepancies, as evidence of some kind of personal pathology rather than professional competence. It was brilliant, in the most chilling sense of that word. He had taken my greatest strength and reframed it, in the minds of people who trusted him completely, as a symptom of personal brokenness. And because he delivered this narrative quietly, privately, never in a sermon, never in writing, never in any form that could be directly traced back to him as a public accusation, he created a situation where, if I ever tried to defend myself publicly, I would appear to be attacking a beloved bishop over vague, unprovable whispers, which would only reinforce the exact narrative he was building about my supposed instability. I want to pause here for a moment, because I think this is the part of the story that matters most for anyone listening who has ever found themselves in a similar position, discovering wrongdoing within a trusted institution, only to find that institution turning its full social weight against you instead of against the wrongdoing itself. This is not rare. This is not some isolated incident specific to one corrupt bishop in one small congregation. This is a pattern that repeats itself across churches, corporations, families, friend groups, any closed community where loyalty to the group's image is valued more highly than loyalty to the truth. The whistleblower almost always becomes the villain of the story before the actual wrongdoer ever does. Because attacking the whistleblower's credibility is so much easier, so much less disruptive to the community's comfort than confronting the wrongdoing itself. I tried, around this time, to bring my findings to the elder board formally, requesting an independent audit of the Benevolence Fund conducted by someone outside the church entirely, a neutral third-party accountant with no personal relationship to Bishop Calloway or anyone in the congregation. I genuinely believed, at the time, that this was the move that would finally cut through all the whispers and innuendo, because numbers do not lie, and an independent audit would either confirm exactly what I had found or clear Bishop Calloway completely, and either outcome would be better than the current cloud of suspicion hanging over my reputation. The elder board, led at the time by a man deeply loyal to Bishop Calloway named Pastor Reeves, his second in command, denied my request. Not outright, not in a way that looked obviously suspicious on paper, but through a slow, deliberate process of stalling that I now recognize as a very deliberate strategy. They told me they needed to discuss it further at the next quarterly meeting. Then they told me they wanted to consult with the church's legal counsel first to understand the implications of an outside audit. Then they told me that bringing in an outside auditor during a sensitive time of internal reflection might create more division than clarity, and perhaps it would be better to revisit the request in 6 months once things had settled down. 6 months. They wanted me to wait 6 months while the narrative about my supposed instability continued spreading unchecked through every small group, every potluck dinner conversation, every quiet exchange in the parking lot after service. I made a decision around this time that I know, looking back, completely changed the trajectory of everything that followed. And I think it is the decision that ultimately makes this story worth telling, even though it did not unfold the way I originally hoped. I stopped trying to convince the church leadership to investigate internally, and I started building a case entirely on my own. The exact same way I would approach any external forensic audit for a paying client, treating Bishop Calloway's financial records with the same rigorous, evidence-based scrutiny I would apply to any company I had never personally trusted or loved. I requested, through entirely legal and proper channels, copies of the church's official tax filings going back 5 years, all of which are public record for any organization holding nonprofit status, something most congregation members never think to check, simply because they trust their leadership completely. I cross-referenced those public filings against the internal benevolence fund records I still had access to from my volunteer work. Records I had, fortunately, kept detailed personal copies of throughout my 6 years of service, never imagining I would one day need them as evidence rather than simply as working documents. What I found, over the course of nearly 3 months of careful, methodical, after-work hours investigation, was far larger and far more disturbing than the original $34,000 discrepancy I had initially brought to Bishop Calloway's attention. The miscellaneous pastoral discretionary use category, when I traced it back across 5 full years rather than just the single year I had originally examined, accounted for slightly over $190,000 in unaccounted disbursements, nearly $200,000, moving out of a fund specifically designated to help struggling families in our congregation, with no applications, no committee approval, no documentation beyond a vague label that Bishop Calloway himself had personally created years earlier, conveniently before the Benevolence Committee's current tracking system had been fully implemented. I also found something else during that investigation, something I had not been specifically looking for but could not ignore once I saw it. A pattern of payments to a private consulting company, payments that occurred almost exactly every quarter for the past 3 years, each one falling just under the threshold that would have required additional board approval under the church's own bylaws. When I researched that consulting company through public business registration records, I discovered it was registered under the name of Bishop Calloway's brother-in-law, operating out of a residential address, rather than any legitimate commercial office. I sat with all of this evidence for nearly 2 weeks before deciding what to do with it, because I understood, finally and completely, the position I was in. If I brought this to the elder board again, the same board that had already stalled my first, far smaller concern for months, I would almost certainly face the same delays, the same dismissals, the same quiet erosion of my credibility, while nothing actually changed. If I went outside the church entirely, to local media, to state nonprofit oversight authorities, I would be doing something that could never be undone, publicly exposing a man who, despite everything, had been a significant figure in my life for nearly 2 decades, and publicly fracturing a community that, whatever its flaws, still contained people I genuinely loved. I chose to do both, but carefully, strategically, the way I would approach uncovering fraud in any professional context, building an airtight case before making a single public move. I compiled everything, every spreadsheet, every bank statement, every public tax filing, every business registration record, into a single comprehensive report, the kind of document I would present in any formal forensic audit. And then, instead of going to local media first, which I worried would be dismissed as a personal vendetta given everything Bishop Calloway had already quietly suggested about my emotional state, I submitted the entire report directly to our state's nonprofit oversight division, the government body specifically responsible for investigating exactly this kind of financial misconduct within registered religious nonprofit organizations. I want you to understand something about that decision, because I think it matters enormously for anyone who finds themselves in a position where they possess damning evidence against someone with significant social power over a community that does not yet believe them. Sometimes the most powerful move is not the loudest one. Sometimes it is the quiet, methodical, undeniable one, built entirely on paper trails and public records rather than on personal testimony that can be dismissed as bias, grief, or instability. The investigation took almost 4 months to conclude. During those 4 months, I continued attending the church, partly out of stubbornness, partly because I refused to let Bishop Calloway's quiet campaign drive me out of a building that held genuine meaning in my life, and partly because some small, persistent part of me needed to watch his face every single Sunday, knowing what I knew, while he stood at that pulpit completely unaware that the ground beneath him had already started shifting in ways he could not yet see. The congregation's treatment of me during those 4 months ranged from cold distance to outright hostility. Diane, the benevolence committee chair, eventually stopped speaking to me entirely. A woman I had considered one of my closest friends within the church told me, during what I thought was a casual coffee catch-up, that several people in our small group had been praying for my healing, language that made unmistakably clear what narrative had taken hold about my mental and emotional state. I lost, during those months, almost every meaningful friendship I had built within that congregation over more than 2 decades, simply for having found something true and refusing to stop pursuing it. The state's nonprofit oversight division eventually confirmed every single finding in my report and expanded on it significantly, uncovering additional financial irregularities I had not even identified myself, including a pattern of inflated reimbursement requests Bishop Calloway had submitted for travel expenses related to conferences that records showed he had never actually attended. The total financial misconduct, once the official investigation concluded, exceeded $260,000 across roughly 6 years. Bishop Calloway resigned from his position 3 weeks after the investigation's findings became public record, releasing a carefully worded statement to the congregation about needing to step back for a season of personal reflection and healing. Language that, ironically, mirrored almost exactly the kind of language he had once used to quietly suggest that I was the one in need of healing. He faced state charges related to nonprofit financial fraud, and as of the time I am telling you this story, that legal process is still ongoing, working its way slowly through a court system that moves far more carefully and far more slowly than any of us would like. I wish I could tell you that the moment the investigation's findings became public, the entire congregation rushed to apologize to me, that every person who had quietly distanced themselves over those 4 months suddenly understood the depth of what they had done by believing whispers over evidence. That is not exactly what happened, though something close to it eventually did unfold, slowly, imperfectly, the way real reconciliation almost always does. Diane was the first person to reach out, nearly 2 weeks after the findings became public, asking if we could meet for coffee, the same kind of coffee meeting where she had once delivered those careful, devastating words about people praying for my healing. She apologized, genuinely, tearfully, telling me she had known, somewhere underneath her own loyalty to Bishop Calloway, that something about his explanations had never fully made sense, but that she had chosen comfort and trust over confrontation, because confronting a man she had respected for over a decade felt too overwhelming to face directly. I forgave her, not instantly, not without complicated feelings I am still working through even now, but I forgave her, because I understood, perhaps better than most people could, exactly how persuasive and disarming Bishop Calloway's particular brand of quiet manipulation had been. Other relationships within that congregation have not recovered, and I do not know if they ever fully will. Some people, even now, even with an official state investigation confirming every single finding I brought forward, still seem to view me with a kind of lingering wariness, as though some residue of Bishop Calloway's carefully planted narrative about my instability never fully washed away, even after the truth came out in full. I think that is one of the most painful lessons buried inside this entire experience. Sometimes, even when you are completely vindicated, even when every piece of evidence proves you were right from the very beginning, some portion of the damage done to your reputation simply never fully repairs itself. People do not always update their feelings about you as quickly or as completely as the facts update around you. The church itself is still standing, still holding services, now under interim leadership, while the congregation searches for a new permanent bishop, a process complicated significantly by the financial scandal that has made some longtime members hesitant to continue their involvement at all. I am still a member, still attending most Sundays, partly out of stubbornness, partly out of genuine love for what that building represents in my life, beyond any single leader who has occupied its pulpit, and partly, I think, because staying feels like its own quiet form of victory after everything that happened to push me out. I think often about the version of myself sitting in Bishop Calloway's office that very first evening, laying spreadsheets across his desk with complete confidence that the truth, presented calmly and professionally, would be enough on its own to resolve everything quickly and cleanly. I feel a complicated kind of tenderness toward her now, looking back, because she did not yet understand something I have since learned in the most painful way possible. Truth, on its own, presented quietly and reasonably to someone with every incentive to bury it, is almost never enough. Truth needs evidence built methodically enough to survive scrutiny. Truth needs patience strong enough to outlast an entire community's instinct to protect its most trusted figure. And sometimes, truth needs you to be willing to stand completely alone, for months, surrounded by people who have decided, however gently, however lovingly they frame it, that you are the problem rather than the person who simply noticed the problem first. If you are listening to this and some part of this story feels uncomfortably familiar to you, if you have ever found yourself holding evidence of something true and watched the people around you choose comfort and loyalty over honesty, I want you to know that the discomfort you feel in that moment is not a sign that you are wrong. It is usually a sign that you are the only person in the room willing to look directly at something everyone else has quietly agreed not to see. I do not know exactly what closure looks like for a story like this one, because in many ways it is still unfolding, still working its way through a legal system, still working its way through the slow, uneven process of a community trying to figure out who it wants to be after discovering the man at its center was never quite who they believed him to be. But I know this much for certain. I would make the exact same choice again, every single time, even knowing in advance every painful month of isolation and quiet hostility that choice would cost me. Because the alternative, staying silent, letting that money keep disappearing from families who genuinely needed it, letting Bishop Calloway continue standing at that pulpit every single Sunday while families struggled to make rent, was never something I could have lived with, no matter how much easier it might have been in the short term. I want to tell you about one specific Sunday during those 4 months, because I think it captures the full weight of what I was living through better than any general description could. It was about 6 weeks after Bishop Calloway's vague announcement from the pulpit, and the congregation had settled into its new, quietly hostile rhythm around me. I had decided, that particular morning, that I was done sitting silently while whispers did all the work that direct conversation should have been doing instead. During the open prayer request portion of the service, a part of our worship where members could stand and share something they wanted the congregation to hold in prayer, I stood up. I had not planned to. I want to be honest about that, because I think people imagine these moments as carefully rehearsed speeches, and mine was not. I stood up, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my own ears, and I said, simply, that I wanted to ask the congregation to pray for transparency and honesty within our church's financial stewardship, and that I hoped anyone with concerns about how donated funds were being used would feel safe bringing those concerns forward, without fear of their character being questioned in return. I did not name Bishop Calloway. I did not mention the benevolence fund directly. I did not need to. The silence that followed my words was unlike any silence I had ever experienced in that building before, thick and immediate, the kind of silence that tells you every single person in the room understood exactly what you meant, even though you said almost nothing concrete at all. Bishop Calloway, standing at the pulpit, did not miss a beat. He thanked me, warmly, for my passion for integrity, and then he pivoted, smoothly, into a brief reflection on how the enemy often uses our deepest convictions to create division and suspicion within the body of Christ, how Satan delights in turning servants of God against each other through doubt and accusation. He never looked directly at me while he said it. He did not need to. I felt 200 pairs of eyes shift toward me anyway, and I sat back down in my pew feeling, for the first time since this entire ordeal began, something closer to rage than sadness. After the service, in the lobby, an older man named Frank, who had served on the elder board for over a decade, approached me. I braced myself, assuming another careful, sympathetic warning about division and grace. Instead, Frank said something that surprised me completely. He leaned in close, lowered his voice, and said, "I don't know what you found, Sarah, but I've had questions about those discretionary numbers for 2 years now, and nobody would let me look closer either." Then he walked away before I could respond, glancing over his shoulder as though even being seen talking to me for too long carried some kind of risk. That brief exchange became important later, because Frank turned out to be one of the very few elder board members willing to quietly support an outside investigation once I eventually pursued one. But in that moment, standing in the lobby with my ears still ringing from Bishop Calloway's pointed sermon pivot, all I felt was the cold, isolating confirmation that other people had seen something wrong long before I had, and had chosen silence anyway, exactly the way I almost had. I also want to tell you about Pastor Reeves, Bishop Calloway's second in command, because his role in all of this complicates the story in a way I think matters. For most of those 4 months, I assumed Pastor Reeves was simply a loyal subordinate, blindly defending his superior out of misplaced trust, the same way most of the congregation was. I learned, much later, after the state investigation concluded, that this was not quite accurate. Pastor Reeves had, in fact, known about the discretionary fund irregularities for nearly 2 years before I ever discovered them myself. He had not orchestrated the fraud, and the investigation never found evidence that he personally profited from it. But he had quietly raised concerns with Bishop Calloway privately on at least 2 occasions, according to internal church emails later obtained during the investigation, and had been told, both times, that the matter was being handled appropriately, and that raising it further would only create unnecessary turmoil within the congregation during a sensitive budget season. Pastor Reeves chose silence, not out of malice, but out of the same quiet institutional instinct that seems to infect almost every closed community eventually, the belief that protecting the appearance of stability matters more than confronting an uncomfortable truth, especially when confronting that truth might cost you your own position, your own relationships, your own sense of belonging within a community you have built your entire life around. When I learned this detail, months after everything became public, I felt something complicated that I am still working through even now. Pastor Reeves was not a villain in the way Bishop Calloway was. He had not stolen anything. He had not orchestrated a cover-up. He had simply done what countless people inside countless institutions do every single day when faced with uncomfortable knowledge about someone in power above them. He had decided that staying quiet felt safer than speaking up. And he had been wrong, and his silence had directly contributed to nearly 2 additional years of stolen funds flowing out of accounts meant to help struggling families. I confronted him about this directly, several weeks after the investigation concluded. Not in anger exactly, though there was certainly some of that present, but mostly out of a genuine need to understand how someone could know what he knew and still actively participate in undermining my credibility during those 4 months, telling members of the elder board, as I later learned he had, that my concerns were likely exaggerated given everything I had apparently been through emotionally in recent years. Pastor Reeves could not fully look me in the eye during that conversation. He told me he was deeply sorry, that he had convinced himself, somehow, that protecting the broader ministry mattered more than protecting any single person's reputation, including mine, and that he had told himself this lie so many times over those 2 years that he had almost started believing it himself. He told me he thought about those families, the ones who never received help from a fund that was supposed to exist specifically for them, every single day now, and that he did not expect forgiveness, only that I would believe he genuinely understood the weight of what his silence had cost. I do not know, even now, exactly how I feel about Pastor Reeves. Some days I view him with something close to compassion, recognizing how easily ordinary, well-meaning people can talk themselves into protecting harmful silence when the alternative feels too disruptive to their own sense of stability. Other days, I think about those 2 extra years, the additional families who went without help, the additional months my own reputation was quietly dismantled while he stayed silent despite already knowing the foundation of Bishop Calloway's explanations was built on sand, and I feel something far less forgiving. I think this complexity matters, though, because it would be easy to tell this story as a simple battle between one corrupt villain and one righteous truth-teller, and reality is rarely that clean. Bishop Calloway was the architect of the fraud itself, undeniably, but the silence that allowed it to continue, the silence that allowed an entire campaign against my credibility to spread unchecked through the congregation, was built collectively by dozens of individually reasonable-seeming decisions made by people who each told themselves some version of the same comforting lie, that staying quiet, just this once, just for now, was the safer, kinder, more faithful choice. There is one more conversation from this period that I think about constantly, maybe more than any other single moment in this entire story. About a month before the state investigation's findings became public, I ran into Bishop Calloway unexpectedly at a grocery store, completely by accident, both of us reaching for the same display of fresh bread at the same time. There was a beat of awkward silence before he spoke first, asking, with what sounded like genuine warmth, how I was holding up given everything happening at the church lately. I do not know what possessed me in that moment, standing in a grocery store aisle with a loaf of bread in my hand, but I asked him directly, quietly, with no spreadsheets between us this time, no formal meeting, just 2 people who had known each other for nearly 2 decades, standing in fluorescent lighting, surrounded by bakery shelves. I asked him if he ever thought about the families who needed that benevolence money and never received it, the ones whose applications might have been quietly redirected or simply never funded, because the money meant for them had gone somewhere else entirely. His face changed in a way I had never seen it change before. Not the practiced warmth, not the controlled exhaustion I had glimpsed once in his office, but something rawer, something that looked, for just a moment, like genuine shame breaking through nearly 2 decades of careful composure. He did not answer my question directly. He simply said, quietly, I used to tell myself I'd pay it back eventually, once things settled down financially on my end. I don't expect you to believe that, and I'm not sure I believe it myself anymore. Then he picked up his bread and walked away, and that was the last real conversation we ever had before his resignation became public a month later. I have turned that grocery store exchange over in my mind more times than I can count, because I think it reveals something important about how ordinary, gradual corruption often happens inside positions of trust. Bishop Calloway did not wake up one morning and decide to become a man who stole from struggling families. I genuinely believe, based on that brief, unguarded moment in a grocery store aisle, that it began smaller, a temporary borrowing during some private financial difficulty, justified internally as something he fully intended to repay, and then compounded slowly, year after year, until the gap had grown too large to ever honestly repay, and the only remaining option was to keep the deception going and hope nobody with the right skills ever looked closely enough to notice. That does not excuse what he did. I want to be completely clear about that. The families who needed that money and never received it were harmed just as severely, regardless of whether the original intention behind the theft was malicious or simply a desperate, escalating mistake nobody had the courage to correct early on. But understanding that complexity has helped me make peace, slowly, imperfectly, with the fact that the man who once held my hand at my mother's funeral and the man who quietly orchestrated a campaign to destroy my credibility were, somehow, impossibly, the exact same person. So where does that leave me now, almost a year removed from that first ordinary Tuesday evening when the numbers simply refused to add up? I still work as a forensic accountant. I still volunteer my time, though now for a different organization entirely, one with significantly more rigorous external auditing built into its structure from the very beginning, partly because of everything I learned through this experience about how easily even well-meaning institutions can drift toward unaccountability without deliberate external checks in place. I still attend that same church most Sundays, sitting in a different pew than I used to, surrounded now by a smaller, quieter congregation still working through what it means to rebuild trust in leadership after discovering how thoroughly that trust had once been betrayed. Some relationships have slowly healed. Others, I suspect, never fully will. And I have made a kind of uneasy peace with that reality, understanding that vindication, even complete and total vindication backed by an official state investigation, does not automatically restore every single thing that quiet, sustained doubt once took from you. What I know for certain, the thing I would tell any person listening to this story who finds themselves holding uncomfortable evidence about someone trusted and beloved within their own community, is this: the discomfort of being doubted, isolated, even quietly turned into the villain of your own true story, is almost never a sign that you have done something wrong. It is far more often a sign that you are standing in a room full of people who have collectively, gently, decided it is easier to doubt the messenger than to face the message itself. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you of a moment in your own life when you had to choose between comfortable silence and uncomfortable truth, I want you to sit with that for a moment before you go. Some stories do not end with the entire world finally seeing you clearly the moment you are proven right. Some stories simply end with you finally being able to look at yourself in the mirror, knowing you told the truth even when an entire room full of people you loved decided, for a while, not to believe you.